Music 292, Weeks 10 and 11. Part 2, Simple Form Analysis. Welcome back again. In this video, we're going to take the definitions that we learned in the last video and start applying them to real pieces of classical music. Let's get started. When looking at large-scale form in any piece, there's a few different things that we're going to want to consider. We're going to want to think about, what is my main melody? We're going to want to think about, do we have moments of contrast? And we're also going to want to think about, does our main melody come back anywhere? So I want you to keep those three things in mind as you go through when you work through some of these sample analyses on your own. All of these pieces are in your course pack, so use that to follow along and take notes. Although I do have the page structures a little bit differently just to be able to fit them on the slides ideally here. I'll also mention as we're getting into this and we're starting to look at the perusal analyses, you're probably going to have to get a little bit creative on how you actually do the annotations there because you can't use pen notation. So if you want to just verbally describe something or use brackets, for example, to indicate certain things, just make sure that I understand what you're trying to communicate there. Feel free to deviate a little bit from the way we would do it if we were handwriting it. I do expect on the assignments, though, that you're going to follow the proper notation. Let's start by having listened to the Mozart Piano Sonata K284, third movement. And I want you to think about as you're listening, where do you think there might be A and B sections? A sections are always going to be really easy because they're going to start your piece. There is an exception to that we'll talk about in second semester, but assume that you're not going to encounter that in first semester. And something that I commonly do with this class when I teach it in person is I have the entire class sing along with the melody because it's really easy to recognize something if you've internalized it by singing it. So I do encourage you to sing along at home. You probably noticed some pretty distinct features as you were looking through here. You immediately probably noticed the repeat sign. Repeat signs are generally going to be indicators of form divisions. They don't tell us everything we need to know, but they do tell us there's a significant division of group 1 and group 2 material. And so we can use that to help determine things, but they're not going to be the only indicators. Sometimes you'll have section changes that don't conform to double bar lines. Double bar lines, though, do impact sections because sections generally do not continue through double bar lines. So this is telling us and confirming what we already suspected, that this is a new section of material. There's some other things that are happening at this location though, and that's that there's pretty significant contrast with the material that comes after the double bar line compared to the material that comes before the double bar line. The material after the double bar line has a different accompaniment rhythm. We're now working mostly quarters and eighths instead of almost exclusively eighths. It has a different contour. It's kind of a descending pattern instead of more of a rising melody. And has a different rate of harmonic change. The harmonies are changing almost every quarter note rather than lasting a half note. It's also significantly more chromatic. We can see G sharps, D naturals, A sharps as we proceed through this music. So all of these elements are telling us that this is contrasting. It's also a contrasting register compared to what had just happened right before the double bar line. So all of this is telling us that it's different enough from A that we probably want it to be its own section. And therefore, we should put a label on the score indicating that. And that label is going to be our B label. All right, have another listen to the piece. The next thing we're going to listen for is, does our A return in any way? How are you going to recognize that? Well, you're going to look for characteristic features of your A melody. So it can be really helpful to stop and say, okay, what are my characteristic features of my melody? We know it goes bum bum ba ba da 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 da. So it could be the two repeated quarter notes and the leap of the fourth that are the thing that help you to hear this. Bum, bum, ba. So let's listen for that in our music. You're going to look for characteristic features of your A melody. And we can hear that pretty clearly in our third system, third bar. In fact, for the first 2 bars of this thing, it's completely identical to bars 1 and 2 of the piece. We also notice rests in all voices, which are a property of beginnings and endings here. So it's really kind of framing off the old thing and saying that a new thing is starting. So we've got 2 features now, the rests and the repetition of a previous beginning, that are confirming that this is probably a new section. However, one thing you might notice is that despite beginning with the same melody as bar 1, this section until the ending double bar line is only 4 bars long, whereas our original A was 8 bars long. So that's telling us that, yes, melodically it sounds like A, it has the same starting motive, but it doesn't end the same way, and thus that's a significant change. For that reason, we're going to call this thing A prime rather than calling it A. And therefore, this is rounded binary form, A, B, A prime. So just to review, we talked about various properties of A sections, B sections, and A prime sections in rounded binary. And we know that rounded binary has the last section repeating the first with significant changes. We also know that rounded binary has B and A prime sections grouped together as a unit. Let's now look at the individual properties of each of the constituent sections to see if this matches with our expectations for rounded binary. Let's start with our A section. Our A section has expository function, modulation partway through, ends with some chord other than the tonic, and has conventional phrase organization. We're going to break this down one at a time. Expository function. Well, I mentioned that expository just means that it presents a distinct theme, and we can see that pretty clearly here. I mean, it's very, very catchy, and we notice this melody when it comes back. So that one is pretty easy to prove. Next, modulation partway through to the dominant or relative major. Well, you do notice in your A section that you've got a repeated accidental that's happening in the second system, and I've circled it here on the figure for you so you can see that a little more clearly. At this point, if we're wanting to figure out modulation, we need to figure out what's our home key and then what could we potentially be going to. We have 2 sharps in the first system and don't seem to have any leading tones, so that's telling it's major. 2 sharp major key is D major. Adding the G sharp onto that, that's adding 1 more sharp to our key signature, and we know that's probably going to be A major. And that's our expectation for modulation. This is modulating partway through to the dominant. A is the dominant of D. So this is doing exactly what we think it should for a rounded binary A section. Next in our definition, we expect our A section to end with some chord other than the tonic of the home key. And that's true here. Our home key is D major, the tonic of D major is D, the ending chord of the A section, which I've circled in purple, is not D. It's an A chord because of the modulation. So this is consistent with our definition. And lastly, conventional phrase organization. Well, this is where we break out the stuff that we've learned in the last 2 units. So we're going to take some time now. We're going to figure out our basic idea and try to map out a phrase model for this. Let's listen to the recording, and I want you to then pause, figure out your basic idea, and then try to map out your segments. came up with a basic idea that looks something along the lines of this, although you may have modified the ending a little bit. I'm going to go with this length of basic idea because I think the slurring in the music is suggesting that bars 1 and 2 should be entirely grouped together. I could have maybe shaved off 2 beats of that thing to make it a little more consistent. That would have slightly modified my analysis. It's not wrong, it's just a different way of looking at it. Based on the BI that I've set up here, I'm expecting my BI to be 2 bars or 2.5 bars. Pickups kind of mess with your basic idea length expectation a little bit, so I just kind of want to have a little tiny aside here about that. Pickups can sometimes create inconsistencies in how your repetitions of your BIs come back in terms of the proportions. So if I have something that's 2 pickup notes and then 2 bars for a BI, we're probably going to expect a 2-bar BI on later repetitions, even though this one is slightly longer than that. That's okay. Assume pickups give you a little flexibility in terms of length. I will notate the differences here, though, just so we can be very, very strict about it as we're learning this definition. All right, mapping out the rest of your segments. Our next material, I would say, is contrasting to what we've just had, although I wouldn't say it's 100% contrasting. It doesn't start the same way as our BI, though. It doesn't start with a quarter, quarter, half. And it does feature a slightly different register that's higher now, and an overall descending kind of motion. So although it does have some similarities to the second bar of B, I think it's different enough in this case that we can probably hear it as con I. You could tack a like on there if you think that it's a little too similar. I will point out here, just because, again, I'm being super precise, this thing is contracted compared to the original length of the BI. The BI was 2.5 bars. This is only 1.5 bars. Looking at the next chunk of music, well, it does the BI all over again. It does modify the ending a little bit, though, but it's slight enough that we probably wouldn't notice all that specifically. And it does retain a lot of similar features like the descending motion, so a lot of the contour is the same. And then finally, to end, we have another contracted con I, because it's doing very, very different things in terms of rhythm, in particular with the triplets embedded inside there. So far, this looks like a period with a very, very slight deviation because of the contraction. And we probably want to prove the other features of period just to verify this. So you might remember period, we expect a weak cadence and then a strong cadence, and thus that's going to create 2 phrases. So next thing I can do is I can look at my harmony, I can look at the other things about phrase structure, and it turns out this is pretty consistent with that. In the middle of bar 4, we have a half cadence that's set up by a cadential 6/4. At the ending of the A section in bar 8, we have a PAC through a 5-chord moving to a 1-chord. And I should probably label this thing with period, but it's getting very cluttered at the moment, and I want you to be able to still read things. So I'm going to leave that off for now. So in fact, we've now proven that this fits the 4 expectations for A sections. It's expository, there's a modulation partway through, it ends with a chord other than the tonic of the home key, and it has conventional phrase organization. The deviations here, I think, are so slight that we're not going to say that this breaks the conventionality. There's a slight contraction, but it otherwise fits what we would expect for period form. All right, let's now take a look at the properties for B sections. Our first property, we expect B sections to be usually shorter than the A, unlike in simple binary. The easiest way to do this when you're doing analysis is literally just to count how many bars are in each section. So I've gone and done that. We have 8 bars in our A section and 4 bars in our B section. This pretty easily proves that the B is shorter than A. Next feature, B sections have contrasting material compared to the A section. So we talked about this already, but just to summarize, the material after the double bar line has a different accompaniment rhythm, contour, and rate of harmonic change, and it's also more chromatic. Next property, B sections often prolong 5 or arrive at the dominant key. Well, to figure this one out, we're probably going to have to break down the harmony, and this means doing some harmonic analysis. In other words, putting in the Roman numerals. So take a minute, pause this video, and do an analysis of your B section. Try to figure out the chords. You are going to have to use some of the concepts that we learned in the harmony units, such as tonicizations and modulations. So just be aware of that as you're working through. Ready? You should have had something that looked somewhat along the lines of this, although your pivot might have been in a slightly different location. You could actually put it slightly later or slightly earlier, and it will still work out. I've decided to put it here because I hear the subdominant in its connecting function as essentially being the transition of key. In terms of looking at the harmony here, well, we see that this B section is ending with a dominant prolongation. It lands on a dominant on the first bar of the third system. That proceeds to move to a cadential 6/4 in the next bar. So that stretching out of 5 with the little tonicization sandwiched in the middle, that's allowing us to hear this as a prolongation. So this is in fact fitting the definition that we expect. It's prolonging 5, and it's arriving at a 5 chord, not the 5 key in this case, but this is still achieving the effect that we're looking for. And then last property, we expect B sections to have retransitional function, ending with a half cadence leading back to the tonic of the home key. Well, in that harmonic analysis that we did, we've actually just kind of proved that as well. We can see that there's a cadential 6/4 at the ending of that B section. We can see that the rests afterwards are separating out an ending. And so, yeah, we've got everything that we need for this to be a half cadence. So we've just seen this is very consistent with the properties we expect for B sections. All right, you probably suspected this was coming. Let's now look at the A prime section. So first property, we expect the A prime section to be a reiteration of motivic material that was first presented in our A section. So in other words, A comes back, but as my second point points out, not identically. So how are we going to recognize it? Well, if you take a look at the score, we already did this when we were mapping out our original sections. We noticed that the basic ideas were essentially the same thing. We see that in both A as well as in A prime in the third system. It's after that point, though, that we get some changes. In the first version, we had a melody that was essentially arriving at a half cadence. But if we look at the A prime, the last 2 bars, we have something that's now arriving at a PAC. It's also half the length of the A section. It's 4 bars here instead of 8 bars. And just to reiterate, it's altered to provide a suitable final cadence in the home key because it's ending in D rather than ending in A. All right, so once again, it's fitting all of the properties we expect for A prime. And that's to be expected because it's the example I chose to put in your course pack. I'm obviously going to choose examples that do the concept that I'm trying to teach. All right, let's do another one. This time we're going to take a look at Bach French Suite No. 2 in C minor, the Allemande movement. Let's have a listen. So once again, we probably want to start by thinking, what is our original melody? And then we want to think, what is contrasting with that? And does our original melody come back? So take a moment based on those features. We're going to listen to the recording one more time. And I want you to try to map out where you think A, B's, and possibly a return of A are happening here. So your best starting strategy for finding large-scale form is to first identify your melody and sing along with it. It's going to help internalize this thing for you. You're then going to listen to see if it comes back anywhere. If the answer to that question is no, then there's no final A section. So it's going to be a binary form, or it's going to be a through composed piece. Through composed means there's no form divisions. It's just all A. If your melody does come back, then that's your A or your A prime section. So that means it's either going to be rounded binary or ternary. You're then going to look for a contrasting B section to confirm that, because we know we need to have that middle section that's going to be different in that case. Let's have a listen. Ready? All right, well, your first thing is very obviously going to be A. So let's just go ahead and put that label on the score now. You probably noticed as you were singing through this thing that there was no repetition of that melody coming back, although there were little snippets here and there that were kind of reminiscent of it. We'll talk about that in just a minute. This means that this form is likely a binary form. It's not through composed, I think, in this case, because we have a pretty significant division at that double bar line. So at that double bar line, let's confirm whether that thing is our B. Well, taking a look at it, the contour is actually quite different. Our A was an ascending melody to start, whereas our B is much more of a changing direction, noodling around kind of melody. Let's now look at our properties for A's and B's and see if this is internally consistent with that. Just to remind you, here's what we expect for binary sections. Two large sections with no recap. The A section will have expository function, modulate partway through, end with a chord other than the tonic, and have conventional phrase organization. Your B section will be longer and more developmental than A, will reestablish the home key, will have looser structure phrase groups, will often incorporate sequences, and commonly incorporates motivic material of A with variation. Let's break that down with the score. All right, A section properties. I know the slide's a little bit cluttered, but I wanted to make sure that everything was visible here. Expository function. I think that's pretty straightforward. That again is just saying we've got a distinct melody. And that is very, very clearly happening here in the opening bars. If I'm ever asking you to prove this on an assignment, you can do it by mapping out a basic idea. Next, modulation partway through to the dominant or the relative major. Well, this whole thing is in the key of C minor, like the title is telling us. So if we're modulating to the dominant, that's going to be G. If we're modulating to the relative major, that's going to be E flat. And in fact, we kind of have both of those things happening here. We have a shift to E flat that's maybe not as clear happening in our second system. It's in the middle of a sequence process, so we don't quite arrive stably on the tonic until the third system. But you can see at the end of the third system first bar, we do have that 5-to-1 chord progression in E flat. We then after that get another shift to G. It's G minor this time, but that is the dominant. And we can see that the whole A section ends with a chord other than the tonic of the home key when it arrives on the tonic of that G minor key area, which I boxed in blue here for you. Conventional phrase organization is going to be kind of hard to prove in this piece, simply because this is a piece from the Baroque era, and these sort of contrapuntal Baroque pieces really feature a lot of melodic overlap, a concept called elision. Because of that, I'm actually not going to focus on that too much in this analysis video, because it's really, really hard to tell where things start and stop. So this is going to be one of those cases where our definition doesn't 100% fit, but it's fitting 3 out of our 4 properties, so that's close enough. All right, let's take a look at our B section. So B section, we expect to be longer and more developmental than A. Once again, let's just count the bars of the 2 sections. Pause the video and do that. You should have 8 bars for your A section and 10 bars for your B section. So this is proving, in fact, that B is longer. The more developmental bit is something you're not familiar with at this point. But in this case, I can break it down a little bit to help explain that concept. More developmental we can see in our B section because there's a ton more modulation here compared to what was in the A section. The A section was in C minor and G minor with kind of a very quick diversion to E flat, whereas our B, it actually modulates about every 2 bars. And you'll notice a ton of accidentals, particularly in the first and the second systems. So that in and of itself is more characteristic of what we would expect for development sections in something like a sonata form, for example. All right, our second property. Our B section should reestablish the home key. In other words, it should come back to C minor at some point. Well, easiest way to do that is to look for the accidentals of C minor and the raised leading tone of C minor. And we can see in the third system of B that the B naturals, which are the leading tones of C minor, start to come back in. We have B naturals, which I've circled in purple, and we also have a return to the 3 flats of the key signature. We don't have other accidentals at this point. So this is the proof that we are now back in C minor. Next definition, we expect B sections to have looser structured phrase groups. Once again, because this is a Baroque era piece and it's more counterpoint, it's going to be a lot harder to prove because we have so many phrase overlaps that it's going to be difficult to tell. But one thing I think that does make it immediately obvious is that our B section is 10 bars long. And we know that a standard phrase length is 8 bars or 16 bars. So 10 bars right there tells us that something's off about the phrase structuring. All right, next aspect of our definitions, we expect B sections to often incorporate sequences. Baroque era pieces, and particularly Bach's dance movements, do a ton of this. And don't forget that you're not necessarily just going to be looking for full sequences. This could involve things like melodic sequences or harmonic sequences. So just to map out a little bit of how that's happening in this piece, I've identified 3 different melodic and or full sequences that are happening in our B section. At the beginning, we have a model in our first bar. So we essentially take the pattern and we shift it up by 4th. We then have another melodic sequence that's happening a bar later. Ya-da-dum-dum-dum is our model, and then it immediately sequences ba-da-dum-bum-bum, and immediately sequences again ba-da-dum-bum-bum. This one's really just featuring that top voice, and it's a very short 1-beat pattern, but it's still there. And then in purple, we have our last sequence pattern. And this is a 2-beat pattern, and it's a full sequence rather than just being a melodic sequence this time. Let's listen to this passage so we can hear it. there's a ton of sequencing in our B section. Our last definition property is that we expect our B section to commonly incorporate motivic material of A with variation. So this is where binary is really quite different than the other two forms. Our B is not necessarily going to be 100% contrasting with what we've heard in the A. The most obvious way that that's apparent in this piece is that the B section starts with the exact same rhythm as A, but it has a different contour. So it's connecting by reminding us of rhythms we've heard already, but it's trying to be different by having the melody go to a new place, go to a new key destination, and also go to a new melodic direction destination. And that's very characteristic of B sections in binary forms. So there you go. This is a piece that is pretty typical in terms of structure for binary form. I've got one more to show you. Let's now move on to our Chopin mazurka. Here's what it sounds like. Take a minute and try to map where you think A, B, and possibly return of A is happening in this piece. Think you've got it? All right, hopefully you ended up with something that looks vaguely like this. And there's a few distinct features that we're going to point this out to you. Now, I'm not going to go super in depth in terms of the definitions here, just because you've already gotten a pretty good sense of breakdown. But I will point out a few features. Number one is you probably put your B at the double bar line. For very obvious reasons, it is a double bar line. But I'll talk about other reasons in just a minute why you probably put that there. You probably put your return of A in the third last system. And in this case, it's a literal exact repetition of what's happening in bar 1 all the way to the end of the A section. So there's no change in this particular case. It's just an exact duplication. Pickup's missing, but that's very insignificant. This piece is a little bit weird in that it has an extra section that I'm going to call a transition. That's that little noodling around section that didn't have any accompaniment to it. That was just a single line melody. And you will see transition sections creep in on occasion in any of the forms that we're looking at. They're going to be things that aren't necessarily super connected to the other melodic content, or sometimes they might be things that fragment earlier melodic content. And they're also going to be things that harmonically don't really seem to go very far. They're not clearly in the tonic, for example. They're not clearly modulating. They're really in a connecting kind of function. With ternary, one of the most important features is contrast between sections. And so I'm going to focus on that in terms of this video. Our A section has a pretty distinct rhythm, quarter, eighth, eighth, quarter, quarter, and that comes back a bunch of times as we go through. Our B section does something quite different. It's dotted half notes combined with triplets. And then a stronger emphasis on triplets as we get further into our B section. Our B section is in a new key. The original key of this piece was G minor, which we could see by the key signature and the raised leading tone in the first bar. But in this B section, we no longer have those F sharps. It's F naturals instead. And this is a shifted B flat major, which we can hear by the 5-to-1 progression in the first 2 bars of the B section. There's a lot of new processes happening in this B section. There's a ton of sequence happening in that chromatic bit that's just above the word sequence. But there's no sequences really in the A section. There's some repetition, but there's not really any repetition plus transposition. And then lastly, our B section is way more chromatic. So if you take a look at the 3 bars, let's say 4 bars just before the words way more chromatic there, you can see that he's actually cycling through a number of different keys here. And they're not closely related keys, even remotely, to our home key. This is quite different from our A section, which was pretty firmly in our home key. We actually didn't modulate at all. So this is a huge amount of contrast here between our sections. B is very, very different from what happens in A. This is the main point of ternary. And anytime you're analyzing a ternary, you need to go and you need to prove this contrast by observing features such as these about your B section, telling us how it's different from the A. Keep in mind, once again, that you're not just going to be focusing on pitch when you're making that analysis. You could focus on things like articulation, for example, register, orchestration, key, harmony, sequence, rhythm, any other factor of the music. You got a lot of flexibility in terms of how to actually prove that. In ternary A's and B sections, we're tight-knit. I'm not going to go do that here because this is a slightly later era piece. This is a Romantic era piece, and they tend to warp the definitions a little bit more. We'll talk about that more in second semester. So thanks for watching. That was an overview of how to use some analytical strategies for taking these definitions and then applying them to your own work with scores. In our next video, we're going to talk about a concept called composite forms, where we essentially have nested forms. See you then.